Hello, I'm Gina Cacici, webinar host with CenterWatch. Welcome to today's webinar on Accelerate the Startup of Your Clinical Trials Without Sacrificing Quality, Common Pitfalls that Cause Delays and How to Avoid Them. This webinar is brought to you by Diligent Pharma. Today's session is expected to be about an hour with a brief presentation and then a question and answer discussion. All participants are in listen-only mode. Feel free to prepare questions for the panel. We encourage you to ask questions at any time during the formal presentation. They will be addressed at the end. If you'd like to ask a question, simply type your question in the area provided and press Enter. Your questions will not be viewable to other attendees. Our moderator for today is Lee Jones, the president of Diligent Pharma. It's my pleasure to hand it over to Lee to get us started.
Thank you very much. I want to welcome everyone to this webinar. We're certainly in for a very informative session because we have very informative speakers and ones who have prepared an interesting topic for all of us today. So I'd like to introduce them both. Our first speaker is going to be Ken Getz. Ken Getz is the director and a professor at the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, Tufts University School of Medicine, where he conducts grant-funded research on pharmaceutical R&D management and execution, protocol design optimization, contract service provider and investigative site management, e-clinical technology, and data usage and patient management. A well-known speaker at conferences, symposia, universities, and investor meetings and corporations, Ken has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals, books, and in trade press, and writes a bi-monthly column nominated for a Neal Award in Applied Clinical Trials. Ken holds a number of board appointments in the private and public sectors and serves on the editorial boards of Pharmaceutical Medicine and Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science. Ken is the founder of CenterWatch, a leading publisher in the clinical trials and our host today, and one of several businesses that he has created and sold. He's also the chairman of CISCRP, a nonprofit organization that he founded to educate and raise public and patient awareness of the clinical research enterprise. Our second speaker will be Jay Turpin. Jay Turpin is head of client services at Diligent Pharma, where he leads a team of staff and auditors that implement a risk-based qualification service for clients. He's been in the pharmaceutical industry for 32 years and has held various leadership roles at some of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. He has a wealth of experience in GMP, GLP, and GCP environments, with significant real-life experience in developing numerous drug candidates. So once again, welcome, and I'll hand it over to Ken Getz to get us started.
Thank you very much, Lee. What a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Diligent for the invitation to participate. It's really a pleasure for me to co-present with Jay. We always have a good time going through our material together and fielding questions, so I'm really looking forward to our session today. My focus is going to be on common pitfalls, if you will, that challenge clinical trial performance. And I need to convey a spoiler alert. Pitfalls, by definition, are usually unknown. They're unsuspected. They're hidden. But the pitfalls that we face within drug development are very well known to all of us. And in fact, they've challenged clinical trial performance for decades. So what I'd really like to do is look at some benchmark practices and give you a sense of our operating environment and some of the primary causes of those challenges pre-pandemic. And then I'll move into a look at pandemic response and how that has helped to shed even more light on what we can do as an enterprise to most effectively deal with these pitfalls and challenges as we move forward and put the pandemic behind us. So let's begin with an historical look at some of our behaviors and practices. And that's really summarized in this slide here. There's a lot that we could look at that really articulates the high failure rate in drug development, the high cost of our programs and our clinical trial activity. Here is another very important high-level indicator, and it relates primarily to cycle time, but I've added some additional data, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. On the left-hand side, we see a trend that we've been monitoring and observing for more than 3 decades. The time that it takes to move a development program from early stage first-in-man studies through to regulatory submission has been rising over time. It's now around 90 months. And then that red segment shows you the regulatory review and approval cycle time. And as I mentioned, our overall drug development durations have been increasing over time. We have yet to see any period where the duration has gotten any shorter or has accelerated. On the right-hand side, we now look at clinical trial cycle times by phase. And in every single case, in every phase, when we look at the benchmark for the current period relative to an earlier time period, the newer or more recent time frame is longer. On the far right-hand side in this table, we show you the variation around the mean time. And that variation started to rise about 20 years ago. And once it gets above about 0.5 or 0.6, that's an indication that we're seeing even less consistent or predictable practice around the mean time. It's one measure of inefficiency. And that level of inefficiency is very pronounced and high today, and it has not really come down in any measurable way. So our cycle times are getting longer, and our practices in general and our experiences are less consistent now than they have been in the past. Many of you have seen the presentation of some of our data from the Tufts Center and a number of other sources, and they really articulate an operating environment that is driven by 3 fundamental factors. And I want to talk about those and then share some data with you. Because when we benchmark practices that articulate and characterize these factors, it really sheds some light on opportunities to improve efficiency and improve performance. Those 3 areas are the complexity, primarily the executional complexity of all of our development activity, the hyper customization, which goes hand in hand with complexity. No 2 clinical trials today are the same. We tend to add so many elements, so many activities, so many nuances to every executional model, and that drives up the complexity. And a big part of that customization relates specifically to the fragmentation that we introduce in every single program or clinical trial activity. We have so many parties, internal as well as external collaborators, that are required in order for us to perform our development activities. So let's look at some data to really understand more about these drivers and how they translate into longer cycle time, higher costs, and high levels of inefficiency. We can begin by just looking at some data that may be familiar to many of you, something that we've been monitoring at the Tufts Center now for over 25 years. All of our work benchmarking protocol design practices comes directly from the sponsor companies themselves. In this particular table, I'm sharing with you the averages for a number of variables, design variables, for the typical phase 3 pivotal trial protocol. And I'm showing it over 3 different time periods, that 2005 timeframe, the 2011, and then the most recent 2020 period. And virtually every variable, every design element has increased with one exception. The total number of endpoints has nearly tripled between 2005 and 2020. And of course, the number of procedures that we perform to support each endpoint has also risen dramatically. The total number of countries, total number of investigative sites have grown remarkably. Total eligibility criteria is one of the few areas that has remained relatively flat, and we believe that is in part due to methodologic flaws in our studies. Today, a lot of organizations lump together multiple inclusion and exclusion criteria and count that as a single eligibility criterion, whereas in the past they treated them separately or counted them separately. So that's one of the reasons why we are tracking more of a flat trend there. Perhaps one of the most dramatic trends in protocol design practice is the volume of data that we now collect. In 2005, on average, we collected about 500,000 data points. In 2020, the typical phase 3 pivotal trial protocol is collecting 3.6 million unique data points, 14% annualized growth rate. Truly remarkable. And of course, the collection of that data, the management of that data, the cleaning of that data, all has costs associated with it. Let's look even further at data volume, because that also sheds more light on the level of customization that we were introducing even before the pandemic. What this table shows is different data sources, and we've asked companies to tell us whether each of these data sources is a contributor to the study database. And no surprise, when this study was conducted in 2019, a very high percentage of companies told us that the case report form data, as well as their local or central lab data, had a high incidence of being included in the study database. But even then, we were already picking up on the use of smartphones, mobile health and wearable devices, patient health information from electronic health and medical records, as well as eCOA and ePro assessment related data. And even then, when we conducted this study, we saw very high projections in the contribution that would come from these various sources within 3 years of when we conducted that particular study. And again, this was pre-pandemic. I'll get to where we are during the pandemic in a moment. The last area I want to touch on is really to characterize the high level of fragmentation that we see today. And that level of fragmentation is really an integral and essential way that we support all of our development activity. There's just a tremendous reliance on contract research organizations, technology, and service vendors to support our activity, and that drives up that level of customization that I was describing. On the left-hand side, I show you the distribution of R&D spending by major segment, the portion that goes to support internal staff and infrastructure, the portion in beige that goes to CRO and technology solutions providers, and that small segment at the very top of each of the bars is the study grants that go to investigative sites. It is remarkable the number of organizations that support and that are involved in clinical research activity today. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing you just an approximate count based on a number of different sources that monitor the landscape of organizations. We're looking today at roughly 4,300 pharma and biotech companies that are actively involved in supporting at least one development program. And we've seen some estimates that put that number even above 5,000. An estimated 3,300 to 3,500 contract research organizations, full service as well as niche service providers, and you see some of the other providers listed as well. The whole vendor qualification area is a great place to really highlight a remarkable level of inefficiency that's introduced as a result of the high customization. This particular table comes from a study that the Tufts Center and the Avoca Group conducted 2 years ago, where we looked at the vendor qualification process and all of the many functions that insert requirements into the assessment process. And here we're listing just some of the qualification areas, those with the highest incidence of use. And they include data privacy and protection, where nearly 95% of companies indicated that they assess that area, facilities management, 21 CFR compliance, IT quality and security, financial stability. The list goes on, and the list is getting longer when we think about all of the areas that are assessed today in order to qualify a vendor. It's a very, very lengthy, time-intensive, and labor-intensive process to identify, select, and qualify vendors and collaborative partners. In the study that we conducted a few years ago, we were able to benchmark the cycle times, and here I'm showing you only the high-level cycle times from request for information that led to the selection of a prioritized list of potential vendors, then the formal RFP process through full qualification assessment, and then the contracting process. In total, this process takes on average 4 to 6 months of time, and it varies substantially depending on whether it's a single service provider who's being qualified or a multi-service provider. We see wide variation by a size of sponsor company. Small companies tend to be slower at the upfront areas of this process and faster at the contracting phase. Large companies tend to be faster at the upfront areas, but they tend to be slower in the contracting phase. I'm also showing you here the coefficients of variation, and all of them are relatively high. They get higher the deeper you get into this process, with the RFP through the qualification assessment process having that 0.7 coefficient of variation around the mean, and then it hits 1 a high level of variation in the contracting process. So this is overall a very time-intensive and inefficient process. We estimate that sponsor companies are spending on the order of $375 to $400 million a year to support this process, and about 25,000 to 30,000 vendors are qualified or requalified annually. One other point I wanted to make, and that is that requalifications are typically not significantly faster than qualifications, though you would expect them to be, given the fact that a sponsor now has more experience with a particular vendor or service provider. But I think it reflects that level of customization that we're introducing to every single clinical trial activity. We hear from many vendors today, an area that we have yet to fully assess, that this time-intensive process has really overburdened them, and there are many vendors who do not have the capacity to continue to support such a high volume of RFI and RFPs and qualification assessment activity. I know Jay will talk more about this a little bit later in our discussion today. One last area I want to focus on is really the punchline, the takeaway, and that is that our complexity and customization in our research activity is inversely related to performance. The more complex our activity, the more customization, and the fragmentation supporting that customization all contributes to longer cycle times, higher dropout rates, a larger number of substantial amendments which are unplanned and unbudgeted. So this table shows you the growth rate of these outcome measures, these performance outcome measures, and the level of significance of the correlation between complexity and that specific outcome measure. And all of them are highly significant, where the overall duration of the study, for example, when the downstream impact of complexity is most understood, that's where we see some of the highest levels of significance. So let's shift gears for a moment now and look at pandemic response. And this holds some unique insights for us. As we all know, the development of COVID-19 vaccines and treatments has been remarkably accelerated. In fact, uh, uh, the Operation Warp Speed vaccines have been developed in 7 to 9 months. We're seeing a number of other treatments now being introduced that fall within the 12 to 24 month time frame, that will fall into that time frame. This represents a 70% time reduction, or a 5-year time savings relative to the average time that it takes to develop an antiviral or anti-infective. What were some of the practices? What were some of the unique conditions that contributed to this unprecedented speed or cycle time? And I think we've seen so much discussion about these primary areas, and I'm summarizing them here for you on the right-hand side of the slide. We saw very, very rapid mobilization of scientific and operating teams, including not only internal staff, but external staff as well. Contract research, solutions providers, all really mobilized with a singular focus and open sharing of data to really target addressing this global health crisis. We saw a tremendous amount of very proactive and accommodating support that came from regulatory agencies and sponsor companies, allowing the execution of our research activity to pivot and adapt very, very quickly. And of course, we saw the very fast or rapid deployment of decentralized clinical trial solutions that included remote and virtual technologies. We saw through the open sharing and collaboration the application of advanced analytics to inform not only the science, but as well the management of this activity. Certainly, the additional funding that was made available by major governments around the world helped to de-risk the high cost of developing vaccines. And we also saw very high public visibility, which early on contributed to the ease with which we were able to recruit for some of our earliest vaccine studies, Operation Warp Speed studies. But as we learn more about what was done to support such unprecedented speed and remarkable performance, we start to see that there are many factors, there are many themes that continue to echo some of those perennial challenges that I was talking about during the pre-pandemic operating activity. So if you speak with investigative sites, for example, and ask them, what has been a positive experience as part of the pandemic response and what has been a negative experience, you hear essentially the following. On the positive side, sites tell us that they have been amazed at the sponsor and regulatory agency responsiveness to adapt and make adjustments. Sites are very, very pleased and happy to be able to offer more choice for patients and to increase convenience and access to clinical trials while minimizing the risk of transmission of the coronavirus. But some of the negatives really echo what we were talking about earlier, that it has increased their workload and they're operating in an even more fragmented and siloed set of partners that have to be trained and brought up to speed, where we do not see a high level of coordination and integration, where there's a lot of uncertainty, and that has contributed to the higher potential for errors and mistakes. And based on comments from sites, it's also contributed to delays in receiving clinical supplies and lab kits, as well as even receiving payments for work that's been performed. So there have been a high number of negatives that sites feel must be addressed, that contribute to inefficiency and that might contribute to challenges to quality if we want to leverage some of the positives or the benefits that have come from pandemic response. And this again is based on feedback from investigative sites. When we speak with sponsor companies, we also get some valuable insights. And this is really a fascinating results that came from a study that the Avoca group conducted earlier this year, essentially a survey of sponsor and CRO companies. And it's a really wonderful measure, if you will, helping us to understand how the pendulum has swung far to the right and how it may begin to swing back to a more modest or moderate level. In this particular study, the Avoca asked sponsors and CROs to indicate which specific solutions or approaches were being used prior to the pandemic, which did they begin using during the pandemic, and that's captured in the first two columns of data in this table. If you combine those two, you see that the vast majority of companies, out of necessity, had to pivot and had to support the use of e-consent, the deployment of remote monitoring, the use of wearable devices and telemedicine visits, and the ability to ship medical supplies and clinical trial supplies directly to the patient's home. Avoca also asked sponsors to comment on where they anticipated strong use of these same decentralized clinical trial solutions when the pandemic is over. And what you see is that in some cases, the percentage that answered that they would anticipate strong use really dropped down even below 50%. So again, a measure of how the pendulum may swing back. And some of that has to do with the uncertainty, as companies indicated, the fact that we don't have clear ROI to help us understand a quantifiable return on the investment to train and deploy some of these and to actually purchase and coordinate and integrate the use of many of these solutions. So there are lots of areas as the collaborative customization continues to rise that companies will look to evaluate. Most organizations agree today that we can expect to see hybrid activity moving forward. Now that we've introduced some of these solutions, now that companies have become more familiar using them, they will become part of a portfolio of potential solutions that will be selected for each individual trial based on patient preferences, based on the capabilities of the organizations and the partners that are supporting that clinical trial activity. So when we put all of this together, what are some of the major implications that we can draw from benchmarked pre-pandemic as well as from pandemic response activity? Well, for one, we can very easily argue that we can expect complexity and customization to continue to rise. And with that, we can expect to see cycle time and our success rates and the cost of development all worsen unless we find new solutions that can really help us manage more of a hybrid operating environment. We see a number of concepts and frameworks that are being shared, some that are now being implemented and piloted by organizations to try to build more agility and flexibility into our the way that we execute on our activities, supported by integrated systems, modified or flexible and adaptable standard operating procedures, and staff that are trained to manage multiple solutions simultaneously, an area that we really haven't considered in the past, trying to support our staff in managing in more of an agile environment. Some organizations are looking to consolidate and even reduce their fixed operating footprint. And just a few other areas we can expect now that we've had this introduction to even higher levels of customization under remote operating models. We can expect to see growing use of even more intermediaries, even more open collaborations that will rely heavily on the use of data and the leveraging of data to inform great science as well as operating performance. And we can also expect to augment our capacity with a number of new techniques, including the use of risk-based quality management techniques, and the application of AI to manage that high volume of data. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jay, and then I look forward to comments and discussion after Jay's presentation. So Jay, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Once again, you've given us an illuminating set of data that really begin to paint a picture of the industry that's challenging, frankly. It's no surprise that the entire industry wants to go faster, get drugs on the market faster, and at the same time, our programs are getting more complicated. They're including more providers that are working together, and ultimately, the procedures in a protocol are getting more numerous and complicated. Ultimately, that's resulting in slower performance across the industry. I'd like to take some time today to really focus on some additional ideas, some things, some new innovative approaches that might be of interest to companies that might help you accelerate your clinical programs to kind of counterbalance some of the pressures that are making things get longer. So when I think back 25 years ago when we ran clinical trials, in many cases, most of the functions were actually owned and managed internally within a pharma company. When I started my clinical research experience, we really did have all the necessary functions in-house. We might bring in a few labs, maybe an imaging vendor, but for the most part, we tried to manage all the steps within a pharma company. But obviously, over the preceding 25 years, there's been a real sea change in terms of how clinical trials get done. Today, pharmaceutical companies leverage CROs to coordinate their trials. There may be some portions that are still being managed within the pharma company, but it really then becomes a collection of team members across all of these companies that bring a piece to the clinical trial process. And today, a clinical study team is a very complex team. It's made up of members from the pharma company themselves, from the CRO, and then a large number of companies that bring to the table different technologies that are enabling clinical research today. These capabilities are necessary, and I think, as we've seen the evolution of science and technology, it's necessary to bring these new capabilities to the table as we do clinical research. But it's really creating a need for a very thoughtful approach to how do you manage these vendors? How do you pick these vendors? How do you make sure the vendors that you are bringing onto your team are the best choice for you as a sponsor company? And today I want to talk a little bit about that and some ideas of how you can manage this group of companies, but also an innovative approach that Diligent Pharma brings to the table that we'd like to share with you as well. All right, guys, trying to get the slide to advance. There we go. Uh-oh, went too many. My apologies. The other piece is their companies are actually trying to also, in addition to all these third-party partners, vendor companies that they're working with, are also trying to integrate the inputs that are coming from regulatory agencies, academic thought leaders, and payers. And all these voices need to be harmonized and brought together into a cohesive clinical trial plan that can be implemented with quality and speed. And we want to make sure that ultimately the outcomes that come out of a clinical trial meet the needs of all the various stakeholders, including the pharmaceutical company themselves. We did do a poll for those of you that registered for this event today, and we thought we would first of all just share that with you. And the question really focused on how many clinical research suppliers have you engaged in some form of qualification over the last 12 months? And you can see there here the demographic. The large number is 1 to 9, but you can see some of the participants today have seen large numbers of vendors and assess them as to whether they're qualified to do work for them. So we have a broad mix, and some have not participated in that process, but this is significant opportunity for you as a member of a study team in a pharma company to make sure you're selecting a partner or partners that are truly qualified and can build on the performance of your individual clinical trials. Um, for those of you who may be familiar, Dr. Edward Deming is actually seen as the father of modern statistical process control. And he had many insights over the years, and he has shaped kind of how modern industry manages variation. But he said that a system is a network of interdependent components that work together to accomplish a common aim, and that a system must have an aim. Without an aim, there is no system. When we begin to think about a clinical trial, it is literally a system. And that system needs to get aligned across all of the individuals and all of the companies that are working together. So part of the challenge for clinical trial managers these days is, how do I get a group of 1 to 2 dozen team members all aligned and moving forward in a common aim? And that takes a lot of communication, a lot of leadership skills, and really a lot of attention to detail to make sure that all the incentives for these individual players are aligned and pointing in the same direction. It's complicated, and sometimes incentives are counterproductive. Sometimes those incentives actually don't help. They can at times hold back performance, and so there needs to be a lot of careful thought about how we organize ourselves with all the many parties and making sure that we've got the best potential partners at the table for our clinical trial teams. And we need to be very clear in communicating what are the common aims for this individual clinical trial. The other concept I'd like to talk about is proactivity. This quote from Ken Perot really is probably something that, for those of us that have been in the industry for a while, have lived this nightmare. You know, you need to be proactive, and if you're not proactive, an apparent insignificant issue today can become tomorrow's catastrophe. And we don't have a poll here, but I will say that if you've been in clinical research anytime at all, you probably experienced a catastrophe. These are difficult, and I think I can think back on my career. I remember in the early days of EDC, working with a small vendor that provided our EDC services. In the middle of the trial, they went bankrupt. That was painful, and we had to work hard to recover and get the data transferred into a new mechanism, and ultimately we were able to finish the study successfully. But I can tell you that was a real catastrophe. And so I think as a leader of clinical research, we need to see what we can do to move from a reactive posture to a proactive posture and anticipate what might hold us back in the future. And frankly, the pressure of accelerated timelines oftentimes pushes study teams toward a reactive posture. Many times they'll feel like, well, I've got to go fast, so I don't really have time to be proactive and plan this trial to the level it needs. Or there may be too many unknowns, and there's just an instinctive reaction to get things started, when in fact maybe the best course of action is take the necessary time to do a thorough overarching plan and make sure that you're thinking through all the risks of the study and shifting from a reactive posture to a proactive posture where you actually can anticipate some problems and potentially eliminate those problems in the early days. I do have a poll question we're going to open up at this time. So if you don't, you should receive a pop-up menu that brings this question to you at this time. The question is, for your individual organization, how often is all vendor qualification completed before their work begins? If you could answer that question, we'll give you a few seconds, and then we'll take a look at the results.
Yes, so just choose from the possible answers by clicking in the little radio button and then submit. Click submit. These polls will stay open for a few more seconds. We'll close the polls in 5 seconds. And here are the results. Jay?
Okay. Let me continue to move forward with some of the accelerated timelines, some ideas. So as I mentioned earlier, every pharmaceutical company wants to move through this process of design, startup, recruiting the patients you need, getting them through their treatment, analyzing the data, and then ultimately reporting out the results. This is common. I think there is a very natural tendency to do what you can to get through these early milestones quickly. And in fact, it creates challenges. What we want to do is think about where the opportunities lie to accelerate a trial. And frankly, the biggest opportunities to make an impact on the speed of the trial is in the beginning. It really does start in the middle of the design process as protocols are being created, formulated, and the parameters in that protocol are being established. There's a huge opportunity to think about that design and how it might affect the overall timeline of a study. There's also opportunity during the startup period to make sure that you're aligning your vendors in a way that you've got a true team that opens up opportunity for them. We're going to talk a little bit about how we can capitalize on this early stages, but ultimately investments in the beginning can reap benefits on the back end of a clinical trial. I might also say that oftentimes companies and trial teams are poorly staffed in the beginning. In the rush to get started, oftentimes there's incomplete staffing of these trials in the beginning, and that leads to really a sub-optimization of how that study is going to run. And I think we ought to be thinking about as an industry, how do we make sure from the onset of the design process through the study, are we making sure we get the right staffing so that we can do a thorough job of planning and move this through the process going forward. So ultimately, there's opportunity here to improve design quality, making sure that the design of the protocol is optimal to meet your objectives and that you've thought through that. We'll talk about some ideas there, that we have good vendor quality. We pick the right players we want to work with, and we've done a robust effort at planning the study, and we understand where our risks are so that we can mitigate where we can, or at least have a contingency plan to make sure that problems are quickly addressed when they come up. The other thing I'll say here is it's really important through this new paradigm of all these companies collaborating that we think about what does it mean to be a team. We really need to bring in all the players within a company, within a pharmaceutical company, as well as all of the provider personnel, and really bring them together with cross-functional and cross-company planning. Ultimately, establishing the relationships that are going to be necessary to execute this clinical trial as quickly as possible. And lastly, there's an opportunity to think about some strategic speed investments in the beginning, which could affect your budget, but also can save you money on the back end through speed, and those need to be thought through carefully. So we have a poll question. How many of you have ever been involved in a trial where you experienced a delay due to the performance of a vendor? You got surprised with the performance of the vendor.
The polls are open. We'll close the poll in 5 seconds. And here are the results. Ooh, lots of yeses.
Okay, so this is a common challenge that all of us have faced, and I think the question when these challenges come up, the key question is, could this have been anticipated? Could we have predicted this? And I think if we could predict performance issues earlier, if we could predict where risks are, that would actually help us significantly as we organize and plan ourselves moving forward. So I want to quickly move to some ideas here, and I'm going to focus really in this front space. Some of the leading companies today are in fact using trial modeling to iterate in trial designs and understand the potential impact of trial variation, the design variation, and how that might affect ultimate outcomes, ultimate speed, ultimate identification of the right patients. Leading companies are investing in this heavily, and many CROs have this capability as well that can help pharmaceutical sponsors really do a lot of work up front optimizing their design before it moves forward into implementation. Another idea is to actually reach out to investigators and patients to get their input. One of the slides that Ken showed that protocol amendments have doubled in the time frame of the surveys that he was looking at. With gathering some of the investigator and patient input earlier, there's actually an opportunity to understand the feasibility of the procedures and the doability of the protocol, and oftentimes actually reduce the amount of protocol amendments that follow, which create pain and difficulty and time and costs for the study, and oftentimes slow down recruitment. Ultimately, taking a quality by design approach can actually help you up front, and the more careful thought that we put into the design, the bigger impact you can have. And ultimately, in this period, you're trying to decide who you want to work with. And in particular, the Diligent team can help you with provider qualification assessment, so that as you're assembling your team, that you have all the data you need to take a risk-based approach to understand who are the players, who are the vendors, and ultimately understand the risk profile that you're taking on when you pick up a new vendor. During the startup phase, once the protocol's designed, then that's where you shift into building the proactive plans. And those plans need to be assembled with all the players contributing to those plans. Risk management needs to be done, understanding the potential risks so that you can mitigate the risks that are possible to mitigate, and also have contingency plans ready if risks materialize throughout the course of the study. But ultimately, as Dr. Deming said, we need to have clear goals, an aim for the study, and that set of goals needs to be aligned across all the players on that team. Additionally, new technologies are bringing new capabilities to give us a window of insight into how the study's running and to assemble data in faster means. That data needs to be integrated, and there needs to be a clear strategy of how those pieces are going to be coming together. So in all this process, it's important to think proactively about how the rest of the study is going to run. We at Diligent can help you with the qualification assessment. Some of those identified gaps can give you some insight as you build your oversight plans. And frankly, you can actually put in place some objectives and some KPIs with your vendors that can just give you a close eye on areas of risk that are important to you, and ultimately position you for success as a team with visibility on how the performance is going through the study. So let me talk to you a little bit about the difference and what is different about Diligent. We actually, in the current state, every sponsor qualifies every vendor. As Ken pointed out earlier, there are over 4,000 sponsors in biotech companies and almost 5,000 technology and clinical providers. If you think about the activity that's here, it's significant and ultimately very challenging. We've heard it's challenging on the sponsor side, and we've heard it's challenging on the provider side to host all these assessments. What we're doing is a very innovative approach where we actually go through this qualification process once per provider. And once it's completed, the documentation is housed on our Diligent Qualification Platform, which enables accelerated speeds to get vendors qualified by numerous sponsors, and that process is not repeated multiple times. So that will actually help you with speed, particularly if you don't have to go through the process and you can leverage completed qualification information from a previous sponsor. We do that, and we are able to do that through the use of standardized qualification standards that we use from the Avoca Quality Consortium. It brings efficiencies to both sponsors and providers. It can speed things up if you can tap into existing qualification data and don't have to repeat it itself. And ultimately, it will reduce risks for both sponsors and providers because of the rigorous standards we utilized. We also focus on how to bring forward new innovations, new technologies, and we can qualify new technology providers quickly, and our standards can bring them some understanding of some of the regulatory requirements that they need to meet. So Diligent is a set of professional services, and I lead the professional services organization. We complete standardized RFI questionnaires in partnership with vendors. Those questionnaires are written in such a way that they ask key questions that align with all the requirements from regulations and other pharma industry standards that have been agreed to by the Avoca Quality Consortium. And we also conduct vendor qualification assessments through the use of auditors. All this work is housed on our Diligent Qualification Platform and can be reused multiple times, bringing speed and efficiency to the industry. Our platform is a cloud-based platform that's available on the web through any web browser, and it can bring efficiencies to your sponsor organization. And it can also help providers by bringing their data quickly to the attention of new sponsors that they may not have experience with. To give you a little background about our standards, we have a core set of standards that apply to every vendor. We apply those to all vendors that we evaluate. These are standard requirements that apply to any vendor that's providing GCP services. And then we add to that core standard a set of technical and/or functional capabilities outlined here on this slide. So we have modules that focus on different sets of capabilities. So when a vendor is under evaluation, we will add to the core standards the specific technical standards that apply to their sets of services. And this will give you some idea how we approach this. And those standards, again, are all created through the Avoca Quality Consortium, our partner company. And there have been vetted by over 100 pharmaceutical and biotech companies that have collaborated to complete those qualification standards. So when a sponsor needs to actually find more providers, they can go to the Diligent Qualification Platform, and we will get them to a completed RFI. It could be existing on our platform immediately, and in that case, it's very, very rapid to get access to that completed RFI. And if it's a new RFI, we can quickly assemble that for you, working with providers that need to complete the questionnaire, but we'll work with them to get that quickly assembled for you. Once you've decided who you want to work with and you want to qualify a vendor, we also have the capability to qualify the vendor. In some cases, there may be an existing report that you can actually tap into, and that can be accessed very, very rapidly. Or you may it may not have been assembled, and we will actually then conduct a new vendor qualification assessment with an auditor and then quickly get that to you to support your work. Ultimately, our solution gives you an opportunity to cut the time it takes for you to get your clinical research up and running. So some real significant time savings, particularly as you're trying to get your clinical team assembled. We can get vendors qualified rapidly to support you. We have a polling question for you real quickly. What pain points are currently or are commonly associated with your organization's vendor qualification process? And on this question, you can feel free to select any of these that apply to you.
Yes, so you can select more than one response to this question. Answers are still being submitted. We will close the poll in 5 seconds. So identifying the best choice of vendor within a specific category received the most responses, 26%.
Yeah, very good. So obviously there are some significant pain points that are that matter. Obviously, identifying the best choice of vendor is a primary opportunity, and I think there's also some resource constraints. As you see, the ability to handle the process with existing resources is a problem, and understanding where the risks are. So some opportunities for us moving forward to see opportunity to improve. We wanted to introduce our diligent approach. It's different, it's innovative. It's a new approach that we believe will bring cycle time reduction and resource efficiency to the industry. We do want to invite you to take a look at some of these helpful resources that are available. We are putting this in the slide deck that'll be provided after this webinar with a link to our Diligent Qualification Platform webpage. We're also providing an article that we completed with Ken and I collaborated on at the completion of the vendor qualification study in 2019. And then we've also provided to you a helpful tech tool providing information on how to manage the study startup process. This tool comes from the Avoca Quality Consortium, our partner company, and we're providing that to you that might provide assistance to you as you're thinking forward on how to accelerate the startup of your studies. And lastly, there's a previous virtual meeting recording with a link from the Avoca group that looked at this topic from last year. So with that, I'm going to turn over back over to the moderator for us to take a look at some questions.
Thank you very much. So everybody, now's your chance to submit your questions. To ask a question, use the question and answer panel on your screen. Type your question in the area provided and press enter. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the remaining time. So this question has come in for Ken. Do you think the acceleration in cycle times from the pandemic, as in the Operation Warp Speed, is scalable to the industry in our go-forward steady state? And if so, to what degree would you surmise?
Wow, that's a good one. First off, let me just say very quickly that obviously the pandemic has represented a unique period for us as an enterprise, and the conditions all, forced so many different stakeholders to come together to contribute to our success and the deployment of solutions that had really only been piloted at best before the pandemic. So really we should view it as sort of a grand pilot, if you will. And I would argue that it's the actual solutions themselves don't hold the key to cycle time. It's insights into the way that we collaborated that hold the greatest insight. And I touched on those. If we can implement long-term more agility and flexibility, better leveraging of data, those are the kinds of things that I think will translate some of the pandemic experience into cycle time reduction. But I could not at this time really project the extent to which we'll see the ability to achieve that level at this time.
All right, we have time for one question for Jay. How do the standardized diligent RFI templates stand up to audits?
Yeah, that's a great question. So maybe just a little bit of background. The diligent RFI templates we use are all predicated on the Avoca Quality Consortium standards. And those qualification standards are managed and maintained by the Avoca Quality Consortium on an ongoing basis. The AQC, we call it the AQC, they actually have 130 plus member companies that are collaborating. There's also efforts to monitor regulations and regulation changes, and those changes are quickly assessed, and these RFIs are updated periodically to reflect the global requirements from agencies around the world. We also take input from our member companies in the AQC, and there may be other requirements in addition to regulations um, that may drive key questions that are important to sponsors regarding performance and capabilities and other areas of risk that may even step outside of the GCP realm, but be more focused on IT security and even things like financial stability of a company. So we try to do a holistic view, and we believe that the RFI templates are very sound and very capable to identify the capabilities of a company and give information that can inform a sponsor of the relative risks of working with that vendor.
Thank you. Lee, do you have any closing comments or remarks?
I want to thank our audience for tuning in today. We certainly found this information to be useful and relevant, and know that that is from our polling of you. I want to also thank our two speakers today, Ken and Jay, and we look forward to continuing to have this dialogue across our industry.
Thank you. I'd like to add my thanks to everyone and to our speakers today. On behalf of CenterWatch and Diligent Pharma, thank you to all of the participants for joining us today. Please be sure to fill out the survey at the conclusion of this webinar. Your feedback really is very important to us. This now concludes today's event. Have a great day, and I hope you join us again in the future.